Hey everyone, welcome to the Anexipod, the official podcast for Anexinet. This is episode 41, recorded April 1st, 2019. I'm your host, Ned Bellavance, Director of Cloud Solutions here at Anexinet. On the Anexipod, we talk technology for the enterprise, covering infrastructure, app dev, analytics, and anything else that is shiny. On this episode, we are going to be talking about the value proposition of secondary storage with Cohesity's Field CTO for Federal and Eastern U.S., Steve Graywall. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure. So, happy April Fool's Day. Hopefully nobody pulled any pranks on you or anything.
Nothing yet.
Yeah. My son said he was plotting, but nothing has sprung up yet, so I'm scared to go home tonight. We'll see what happens. Well,
TBD.
Yeah. Before we dive into the topic at hand, why don't you first tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background in the field?
Sure. So I've been in the technology field for about 20 years. I got started, in the technology space as more of a practitioner, more of a hands-on guy. I got started as a sysadmin, working on Microsoft environments. I was originally a help desk, also did help desk and tech support. And then after that, I got into the network engineering arena around routing, switching, and so really kind of had a good cross section between understanding all aspects of infrastructure, not only systems but the network engineering side of the house. From there, had a chance to move into more of a management role, kind of overseeing IT operations, all disciplines of IT operations, not just infrastructure, but everything else that comes with an infrastructure, the IT organization. And from there, I moved into a variety of C-level roles, most recently serving as a CIO, a CTO, and a CISO for a handful of large government organizations. And after my tour in government, which lasted about 16 years, and working at across 4 agencies, I joined Cohesity a little over a year ago as a CTO for Federal and Eastern U.S. And my role is really focused on kind of all aspects of go-to-market as a CTO, and really, learned about Cohesity during my tenure as a CIO, as I was dealing with, similar challenges as most IT organizations, thinking about, next-gen emerging technologies, how to get, the best architecture in place is how I came across Cohesity when I was doing market research, and was just incredibly impressed by what the company was doing, and decided to join and be part of the movement. And so it's been great.
All right. So 16 years in government. Wow, that's a long tour. I bet you learned how to work in interesting and large organizations. It's got to be a big challenge as opposed to a smaller, or medium-sized organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can imagine the politics in some of these large organizations and the policies that are in place to govern, and in cases where the policies haven't caught up to the technology, that can be an interesting challenge there. And then, also having started my career in the private sector, really during the .com boom and then bust. I mean, really seeing the startup scene back then, working for some of the .com darlings. And then as, we had kind of the tech meltdown or the .com bust, transitioning into government, and then now kind of moving back into the private sector, working for a Valley tech company. It's been very, very beneficial to actually have experienced both, working, seeing the last 20 years of not only how industries change and how technology's matured, but having that exposure working both for private and the public sector has been very, very fruitful.
Yeah, I got to imagine that's an interesting experience. But the topic I wanted to talk about today really has to do with the evolution of what I'm kind of calling like second tier storage. So obviously not necessarily your primary stuff where your database runs or where all your VM workloads are, but that secondary tier that exists. So I'm going to start in sort of a strange place, but bear with me. There's a thing that's called aggregation theory. And it's been championed by people like Ben Thompson from Strategy. And he approaches the idea by looking at the value chain that's composed of three components. It's suppliers, distributors, and consumers. And so an aggregator is an entity within that value chain that can take the content created by suppliers and offer it up to consumers with the lowest transaction cost and the best user experience. So you could think of Google as sort of an aggregator of website content. So I think in a way, backup vendors and that secondary tier represent an aggregator of data from multiple suppliers. Does that make sense? Does that sort of resonate with what you've seen?
Yeah, I think that construct is very much applicable to the kind of data protection or backup space historically. Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, in the past, when I've seen backup vendors try to provide that additional value, because I guess sort of the idea behind an aggregator is that you're providing additional value that each of those multiple suppliers can't give directly to the customer. When they've tried to do that in the past, it doesn't seem to necessarily always work out well. So what do you think has blocked in the past backup vendors in the secondary tier from really capitalizing on this idea of aggregation?
Sure. I think it's two things. I think it's fundamentally the architectures that these organizations have in place, and then their philosophy on how they do business. I mean, we always say, backups are worthless and restores are priceless. But along those lines, I think when we talk about hyperconvergence or aggregation in general, right, I think the reason they have not been able to unleash the additional value of those assets is because those data assets based on those legacy architectures have not been readily available for consumption and have been very siloed. So, very little innovation in that backup space as a whole, I would say, over the last, decade or so, give or take. I mean, the last big innovation was data domain, which is a kind of a target storage dedupe play. But the fundamental, I think, mindset around, this is not just data protection or backup for the sake of an insurance policy, but if you're consolidating or aggregating those data assets in a central way, how can you also unleash and make those assets available for other use cases, other workloads, and just the whole notion of better consumption for data? Gartner has coined a term called dark data, right? And the whole premise behind dark data is we capture a bunch of data, we collect a bunch of data, we back that data up, but the data is really not available for analysis, for running different models and what have you. So I think if you look across the space and some of the players who are in the space, they've really had a kind of a one-track mindset on everything from design, implementation, and operations, which is, hey, run the backups as an insurance policy, but they haven't really revisited the architecture as a whole on how do you make that aggregation more lucrative for organizations, both technically and financially. And more importantly, from a business perspective, right? We say data is the new oil, and it's end of the day. I mean, if we think about a lot of the digital transformation initiatives, we look at some of the companies who've done a phenomenal job with kind of overall customer experience, UX, CX, and everything else. I mean, a lot of that is really driven by the data, understanding your consumers, understanding your constituents, and so the whole movement around digital transformation. And what I think in a more oversimplified way, just how can we better apply technology to the customer experience, right? Fundamentally, I think that's where there's been a big disconnect historically, where vendors have not been able to, kind of realize customers have not been able to realize that vision, and the vendors in the space have not been able to implement that vision, because these architectures that support that fundamental shift in direction are ground up, right? They're not architectures where you can easily pivot, given the investment in some of the legacy tooling and what have you. So I would say that's the biggest reason we have not been able to kind of realize the value of aggregation in the past.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think when you said dark data, I immediately thought of tape. Right, because to me, tape, you put that data on a tape, you ship it off to Iron Mountain or wherever, and then there's no easy way to get that data back to do analysis on it. It's kind of like there's a catalog somewhere that tells you what files are there, but you have no idea what's on those files or how they work. I guess the move to having backup to disk at least brought us a little bit closer to having it no longer dark data. But what else do you need to unlock that potential?
Yeah, I would say the indexing and cataloging, right? So we very much kind of now live in a decentralized world of data environments. I mean, we think about the cloud, we think about on-premise, very much kind of a federated architecture around where the data may live. So I think the ability to index and be able to, and the corresponding metadata to identify exactly where that data lives without these complex restore environments like you mentioned, right? I mean, you have tapes and sometimes you have offsite storage for those tapes, or you may have other means of backing up that data, which may not be available in a readily accessible fashion, right? So not only do we not know what lives on those various mediums and formats and what have you, in the event we need access to that data, typically there's proprietary infrastructure, hardware, software, et cetera, that's needed to even resurrect that data. So it's really the ability to have that unified view of no matter where your data lives, whether it's an Amazon, cloud commodity storage environment, whether it's at your disaster recovery site, whether it's on premise, it's really having the visibility and that unified view via indexing, et cetera, across the board. I mean, that's really the big shift in terms of how, regardless of where your data may live, at a fingertips notice, almost like Google. You talked a little bit about Google and the search area being an aggregator, but our DNA and our roots architecturally are very much aligned and modeled off the Google file system. Our founder and CEO actually was the lead developer of the Google file system and was there in the early days of Google and understands hyperscale, understands distributed systems, and a lot of his original thinking and design principles around how to best, architect a next gen data protection solution came from Google. I mean, and the premise was, hey, Google in our personal lives is incredible. It's very useful. It's resourceful, very effective. At a fingertips notice, you can pretty much gain access to a bunch of stuff. Why can't we bring that same experience to the enterprise data center? And that's essentially how Cohesity, came about. And before Cohesity, he also understands hyperconvergence. I mean, I think there's a lot of buzz now about hyperconvergence. So he was also the CTO and co-founder for Nutanix, and really kind of helped disrupt and innovate the primary storage space. And after Nutanix has had an incredible run in primary storage, hyperconverged. I mean, Magic Quadrant leader. They pretty much have the market share in that space. But during his time there, it's interesting. He said, "Hey, we've taken kind of compute storage, networking, and what have you, and for lack of a better term, consolidated or hyperconverged, and that's going great. But I see a much bigger opportunity here. I mean, on average, just to give you one data point, on average, if you look at a data center across verticals, across industries, about 20% is primary storage, and the best way to think about primary storage, like you mentioned earlier, was your VMs, your mission critical assets, your high IOPS workloads, really your crown jewels. But then 80% of the data centers, all these other, footprints of data, which we define as secondary storage, right? Backups, archives, test dev, file and object, you name it. And even from my experience being a former CIO and running these large complex organizations, typically each of those areas is a different vendor, different technology, lack of interoperability, right? Different skill sets, a ton of unnecessary complexity, et cetera. So that's really where Cohesity's bread and butter is really simplifying that from all angles, simplifying the tech, simplifying the financials, simplifying the management of that, and then really getting a simple architecture in place that gives you the best use and access to your data.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. I will say, so to go back to the idea of proprietary systems holding your data, I can think of several organizations that when they switched backup vendors, for the next 2 to 5 years, they had to keep their old backup software running on an old server somewhere, just in case they needed to recover anything from that old system, because the format it wrote in was completely unusable by anything but that backup solution, which, I mean, your data's locked up, basically. That's not a good place to be. And then on the other side, the proprietary systems, I mean, you've got maybe one system to archive your email. You've got another system for archiving your files. You got your test dev. Like, I guess one of the biggest challenges is, yes, maybe I can back that up, but how do I aggregate it and put it all in some sort of metadata pool that I can search on? How do you do that, and how do you make that experience good for the end user?
Yeah, so when we start to, we understand the complexities of having these legacy environments, and in some cases, there's no kind of flip the switch and migrate overnight solution. So, we understand the change management hurdles, and we've organized and designed our solution accordingly. What I mean by that is, for example, if you want to take more of a phased approach as part of your adoption journey, we can simply even service target storage on day one. So if you have a heavy investment in a Veritas, a heavy investment in a Commvault, whatever your backup environment or solution may be, we have the ability to simply just service target storage, meaning you can point the software there, and it gives you a little bit more flexibility on moving at your own pace. More importantly, as we start to phase in what we call as data protect, which is our software, right? That's where a lot of the secret sauce comes into play around, moving data sources for both, unstructured repositories, files, images, et cetera, but then also structured, backups. Think about things like databases and transactional areas, right? So as you start to, migrate, your infrastructure over to Cohesity, right, we have the ability to do indexing on ingest, and we start to really develop an entire a catalog of that index, and we know exactly where everything lives. And even going back to the roots with Google, from an administrator, a backup administrator or a systems administrator, their entire experience is so simplified. Even just, one basic example of how they're able to do searches and how they're able to just literally pull up file names in a very easy fashion without knowing server names, directories, file structure. So it really makes everyone's life incredibly easy on how they utilize that information as it's indexed as we start to build the centralized repository.
Okay. Yeah, that all makes sense. And so, once you've built up that centralized repository, I think you said backups don't matter, but restores are gold or something along those lines.
Yep.
But I think of, backup and restore are kind of table stakes. Your solution, it has to do that. But if you're becoming that larger aggregator that's providing additional value, I mean, and you've put all this awesome tech in place to ingest that data and index it and catalog it, what kind of new and interesting solutions and improvements can you do beyond just the scope of backup and recovery?
Yeah. So absolutely. Another area that we, is again, have heavily commoditized different vendors. So usually the first use case that most organizations adopt is data protection backup. If you have that in place, right, and you start to think about horizontal expansion, file and object is another area that we often encounter use cases like scale out NAS. Right now that you have that data centralized, why go out and build another layer of complexity or actually stand up another tool or another vendor? We can do file and object multi-protocol support. So everything from your file shares, whether it's SMB or NFS, or even if you have a on-prem cloud-like storage offering like an S3, we're multi-protocol support, which a lot of people get excited about. And then more importantly, there's, I would say, the 2 or 3 other areas that are very exciting in terms of the aggregation, the broader kind of thinking around value will be that we talked about the data, right? So all the analytics, right? Our platform has MapReduce, baked in. So in terms of being able to actually use that data, consume that data, we start to get into the analytics space, which, again, there's a pretty broad scoping there on how folks identify analytics. And then I would say the cloud, right? I mean, I think there's been a lot of confusion with the cloud over the last decade or so. I mean, Amazon, of course, had a head start, and I think early stages really worked on, trying to convince folks that all public cloud was the answer to everyone's problems. I think for a variety of reasons we kind of experienced around whether it's vendor lock-in or the economics. Fast forward, here we are, and really, hybrid multi-cloud is the future. Microsoft Azure's come a long way around maturing their public cloud offerings, and of course, Google with GCP. But a lot of folks, want to leverage the cloud. They want to design for and solve for kind of this hybrid multi-cloud environment. But I think the challenge is they still have a large portfolio of what I call legacy applications or legacy systems that aren't really cloud native. They're not cloud native ready. They're and of course, service delivery and operations are priority number one. So I think the challenge with a lot of these large organizations is, hey, I got to run the stuff that I have, for obvious reasons. I want to start to invest in technologies that give me that kind of transient or alignment with a public cloud. And the reason I think we're incredibly unique there is, I'm of the mindset, just being in the business for the last 20 years, kind of seeing everything from the late 90s to present, that just the pace of innovation and change is so much faster than it was. I mean, it's amazing how how many new technologies, the pace of innovation we're seeing, just overall. And, I say that to say what's best of breed today may not be best of breed tomorrow, right? But the one thing that I think can double down on is our data, right? I mean, our data is absolutely paramount to whatever our mission space may be. So I think of kind of, as we're thinking about hybrid multi-cloud architectures, you want the simplification, leveraging hyperconverged and things of that nature. You want orchestration, automation capabilities, but more importantly, you want some level of architectural consistency with the public cloud providers. So you're able to take advantage of those services on your own terms. If you have a peak business process, during a certain window, and you want to swing a workload to leverage the elasticity and capacity of an Amazon, you should be able to do that in the most kind of seamless way, right? And I think where we're incredibly unique there is we have a common data fabric, and we're cloud agnostic. So what I mean by that is everything from an edge site, a remote office, branch office site, to your primary data center environment that you're managing, to the public cloud, we have the ability to give you a common data fabric in a unified way. So you're able to move that data agnostic of the cloud providers up to the cloud, back down to your data center, in a very seamless way, which I think is powerful, because again, I think the big public CSPs are going to continue innovating. As the deeper you embed with them, you certainly have this challenge of, okay, and now if I want to move from a AWS to an Azure, there's going to be some level of replatforming, refactoring, right? So even if you're able to automate some of those changes and moves as you span across these infrastructures, you want to make sure you have complete and total control over your data. So there's none of those challenges we talked about. We're very unique. And that also starts to get into some really interesting disaster recovery use cases. I think another target-rich area for reducing costs, reducing complexity. A lot of organizations, using the kind of the traditional construct of cold, warm, hot sites, there's still a lot of DR investments that are idle, that are basically on standby. So I think really kind of as you start to think about how do you best shift from that standby to on-demand disaster recovery architecture, technologies and platforms like Cohesity help you do that. We have the ability to take your VM infrastructure that could be running on premise and actually spin up your entire VM infrastructure in a AWS compute environment, in an Azure compute environment. So if you start to think about the value there, not only the technical value but the financial savings, it's incredibly powerful. And some of the part of our secret sauce around how we do that is the architecture. We call it instant master recovery, where we can just literally spin up hundreds of VMs in these environments in a temporary state, and it's full life cycle disaster recovery. So it's not only failing over to these environments, but it's also failing back, and it gives you that entire life cycle. So that's been another really exciting area around aggregation, unleashing value, from a central platform, as opposed to doing these things in individual work streams that can be ineffective.
All right. Yeah, one of the things that you kind of touched on a little bit is that, if I could reinterpret, it's sort of on-premises is becoming more cloud-like. We want hyper-converged because it's a simpler interface. It's a snap-in. You're buying capacity as you need it. kind of like you do with the cloud deployment, and the look and feel of it. It's very API driven. So I feel like cloud is already having a huge impact on how we're architecting new systems for on-prem. The other big thing for me about that is having a consistent experience between what you do in public cloud and what you do in your private cloud. If you could build something that is consistent across both, that makes the admin's job that much easier, because they're not using two different tool sets, learning two or even more different tools to manage their environment.
Exactly. And yeah, and to your point, right? I mean, I think these days we're calling it the digital revolution, or we talked about digital transformation, but really, I mean, organizations are going to have to rely on tech to stay competitive. And as we start to think about some of the commodity IT areas or infrastructure-driven areas that are required, how do we simplify that? How do we get the plumbing and stitching stable, repeatable, and consistent as possible, so we can then redirect kind of our resources and our capacity towards what I call kind of the mission or the customer IT side of the house, right? And that's why I think it's really interesting. I mean, some of the stuff we're seeing now with platform as a service tools, and how even the orchestration automation capabilities give you the ability to implement different pipelines and within your data centers. But really, it's a common experience, and that's why I think one of the reasons primary hyperconvergence took off the way it did was because it was giving you that synchronization across public CSPs in your data centers, and giving you a more common view and a common operating model to do things. And of course, hyperconvergence in general, I think, is a big part there. But that's exactly where things are headed.
Right. And you said you come from an infrastructure background, so you remember the dark days of having to hand provision and hand write and then deploy every single component in your environment. And I'm sure you thought to yourself, there's got to be a better way of doing this.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, I remember the absolute very kind of manual steps and trying to stitch it all together, and even then going back and intervening to confirm the results. But yeah, it's very exciting, even just to kind of watch how the industry and how the technology has matured. I remember working for what they were calling back then application service providers, ASPs, in the late 90s timeframe, and the business models were there. But the tech just wasn't mature, where, it was just outsourced IT or kind of a managed service provider type environment for a lot of the services. And here we are, 20 years later. And, Amazon and AWS has just done phenomenal. But it just demonstrates that there was a huge kind of gap and an opportunity to help streamline how we did things historically inside the data center.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I look back at some of the dot booms that happened, the implosions of a lot of companies, it's not necessarily that their business idea was fundamentally flawed. It was that either the technology wasn't there yet, or the market wasn't there yet. It wasn't ready to trust in whatever that new thing was. And then we fast forward to 15 years later. Now the same concepts are booming successes because the technology is there, the infrastructure is there, and the market is ready to consume that business idea.
Precisely. And even it's amazing. Even companies like Dropbox and Box are basically just doing SaaS-based storage. I mean, there was several companies I remember in the late 90s that tried to do the same kind of thing, but like you said, the demand element, and then of course the technology maturity. So it's pretty exciting to see some of the same ideas and concepts that are making their way back, that were explored back then, but are now actually having success because of those reasons. And I find it fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It's crazy. I did want to double back on one of the things you brought up was that MapReduce is baked into the solution, and you're doing some level of analytics on the data that's being ingested. So are there future plans or ideas for how to more, I won't say aggressively, but how to make that even more useful to the customer? I mean, that's a potential wellspring of interesting information and insight.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say a few things there, right? I mean, in today's environment, we have something called analytics workbench, which gives you the ability to do some cool things. So e-discovery type use cases where you can go and do some deep searches against your data, even simple things like pattern matching, right? So if you want to go crawl your data and see if there's social security numbers and what have you, we have we have applications that are available via what we call the analyst workbench, which gives you the ability to do that. But more importantly, more forward-looking, we've also launched a SaaS-based, kind of an overall health and hygiene engine, which basically helps us do cluster management. If you're familiar, there's the new kind of AI ops space on as you're collecting all this data across these customer environments, how can you then proactively actually do the health and hygiene pieces around, automated response actions, leveraging things like AI ML. So that's really where we're going now, is that given we have a SaaS, offering that does the oversight management for all these environments, the more data we have, the more customer experiences we have, the system over time gets smarter, leveraging some of those models and algorithms. And then really from a customer perspective, the goal is to get ahead of these issues, right? So it's more of a proactive model to really prevent outages, share data across customer environments where there's not security or privacy concerns, obviously, and really strengthen the overall operating model using this service. That's really where things are headed.
All right. You briefly mentioned security and privacy, and I'm sure working with government institutions and having been in government for so long, security and privacy are like top of mind. So what sort of things do you have to bake into a solution to ensure that you're doing it in a way that's secure and you're going to protect individual companies' privacy while still having that interesting information trickle up to your SaaS so you can make insights across all of your clients?
Yeah, security and privacy, like you said, are paramount in government. I mean, we currently support the intelligence community and the Department of Defense as well as civilian agencies. So we work in highly classified environments, and there's a lot there in terms of compliance, but compliance and security. But really, I think understanding that as you centralize these data assets, security is even more and more important. Pretty much have a security first policy around development. So as you centralize those data assets, chief information security officers will tell you that it becomes a target rich environment. So everything from technical controls, access controls, strong authentication, encryption, all of those best practices that are incredibly important to make sure you can provide the confidentiality, integrity, and maintain the availability of these environments has been paramount. I mean, we've gone through a very comprehensive security assessments, leveraging NIST. NIST has a lot of compliance frameworks. The government has a process called ATOs, which is authorities to operate, where again you have to go through a very extensive and a deep assessment of security on the system, and making sure you have segmentation, making sure you have those controls, making sure the integrity elements are all there. So that's been very much part of my charter. I actually also served as a CISO for the Department of Education, which houses all the student lending data. So over 100 million identities. You can just imagine the sensitivities around the data there. So coming on board and joining Cohesity, part of my charter as the federal CTO is making sure we stay up to par and ahead of the curve on all things security, whether it's compliance, whether it's tech controls, and make sure we actually maintain that. So that's been very much a priority for the company.
Yeah, that's very good to hear. I know a lot of people are finally gaining some awareness about security and privacy outside of government and those kind of organizations. Just like Joe Consumers finally cares about privacy. It's like, yes, we finally got them aware.
Exactly.
So
it's like DR. It's like the traditional DR debate, right? It's like security. I know, being a former CISO, if some of the very high-profile breaches have actually kind of worked in two ways. Of course, unfortunate immediate impact and damages to organizations. But I would say the one positive that's been there with these high-profile breaches has been education training, and kind of awareness. For the very senior ranks. Folks that are not necessarily tech-savvy folks, per se, in some cases, or even the C-suite. I think the C-suite understanding the impact of that has been kind of a pro or a benefit of some of those breaches, where, literally companies can go out of business, and not to mention the individual harm. So that's definitely been a positive there overall, I think, from some of these high-profile breaches, and people are understanding. I mean, it's like I mentioned DR. I mean, it was always a probability of investment, probability of occurrence versus investment debate on disaster recovery, and security is kind of one of those things where, if you don't make the right investments up front and you don't take the right actions up front, I mean, you can really have some major blowback to the business.
Yeah, and I would say, DR might not be that likely, but the idea that you're going to get hacked is almost 100% certain at this point.
Oh, yeah.
I hear assumed
no
breach
such organization is a hack-proof organization these days.
Exactly. So we're starting to come up on time for the podcast, but I want to give you, an opportunity with any final thoughts on what it means to, be in this secondary storage space and push these solutions forward. Any last thoughts or ideas?
Yeah, my advice would be to organizations, whether they're small, medium, large. I mean, take a hard look at the secondary storage space and hyperconvergence space. And, I think it's really not only helping with overall architectural alignment of where the future is going, as we discussed with cloud, and where folks want to go. And take a close look at the kind of the financial and the ROI piece, right? I mean, we talked a lot about the aggregator model. And I think that aggregator model is important as you're thinking about ROI and as you're thinking about total cost of ownership. I mean, we're not just a backup company. We of course focus on backups, and we focus on all the other additional use cases we talked about. So not only as you're vetting the technology and getting more informed about the space and the offerings and the vendors that play in it, but also I think given budgets are tight and given most organizations are looking for efficiencies within to reduce spend on their kind of legacy technologies, I'd also say take a close and hard look at the financial aspect of what you're spending on your current environment, all the tools around it. And then, of course, I would say finally the workforce piece, right? I mean, a lot of organizations still spend a lot of money on customized knowledge or legacy skill sets. I mean, that very much is also part of that discussion. So technically, financially, and from a workforce perspective, I would say take a close and hard look at technologies like Cohesity and how they can, help you not only where you want to go today, but also position and posture you for the future, so you have that common, simple operator experience across your data center and the cloud, and you can make the most of your data in that process.
All right. That's really good stuff. If people want to know more about Cohesity or you, where can they follow along? Where should they go to get more information?
They can definitely go to the Cohesity website. So that's just www.cohesity.com. And I can be found on LinkedIn. Steve, first name, last name spelled Grewal. Please do feel free to drop me a message if you'd like to chat further, or if you want to brainstorm. Would love to have the conversation. I'm very passionate about this topic, and I think it's helping organizations in a big way.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for taking the time today to be on the Anexipod.
No problem. Thank you so much for having me.
Sure. And that was our show with Steve Grewal. Thanks to the marketing team for helping me pull this together. Thanks to Anexinet for helping produce this podcast. If you're looking for a company to help you get the complete digital experience, then I would recommend reaching out to Anexinet to see how we can help. If you've enjoyed this episode of Anexipod, why not leave a nice review on iTunes? If you're looking for more content, you can check out our sister podcast, Buffer Overflow. On the show, I am joined weekly by my co-hosts to discuss what's new and interesting in the IT news sphere. You can find out more about me and what I'm up to on Twitter at Ned1313 or on my website, nedinthecloud.com. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, IT moves pretty fast. If you don't stop to look around once in a while, you could miss it.